The compass was in Harriet Slater's hand when she found out that everything she had believed about her journey west was built on a lie. She stood in the middle of the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, in the blazing heat of July, 1878, and she held the brass compass her father had pressed into her palm on his deathbed, and she read the letter that had just been delivered to her by a trembling boy of 12, who clearly wanted nothing to do with whatever it contained. The letter bore the name of a land agent by the name of Cornelius Pratt, and it informed Harriet, in the clipped and merciless language of legal correspondence, that the land parcel her father had purchased 3 years prior, the 60 acres east of the Cimarron River that he had told her represented their future, her future, the future of the Slater name on the American frontier, had been sold. Sold again. To a cattleman. The deed her father had died clutching, the deed Harriet had carried rolled inside her boot across 4 states and 2 territories, was fraudulent. She had come 2,000 miles for nothing. No, that was not quite right. She had come 2,000 miles carrying her father's compass and her father's dream, and someone in this dusty, sun-bleached town had stolen both from beneath her before she had even arrived. Her hands were not shaking. That surprised her. She had always expected that the moment her world collapsed, she would shake. But there was something cold and iron-hard moving through her chest, and her hands were completely still, and the compass needle was pointing north as it always did, perfectly indifferent to catastrophe. "Miss," said a voice behind her. She did not turn around. "Miss, you have been standing in the middle of this street for approximately 4 minutes, and Charlie Dunmore's freight wagon is going to need to come through here in about 2 more. She turned then, because the voice was not unkind, and because it was right. He was leaning against the post of the land office. The very land office, she would later understand, that had facilitated the theft of her 60 acres, with his arms folded, and his hat pushed back from his forehead in a way that suggested he was a man who spent a great deal of time squinting at things that needed careful consideration. He was tall, lean in the way that men who work outdoors become lean, with dark hair that was sun-touched at the edges and a jaw that had seen better mornings. His eyes were a particular shade of gray-green that Harriet would spend a considerable amount of time, in the weeks that followed, trying to name accurately and failing. He wore a deputy's badge on his vest, and he wore it with the casual authority of a man who had not chosen the badge so much as the badge had chosen him. "Edgar Keating," he said, pushing off the post and touching the brim of his hat, "Deputy Sheriff of Sumner County, and you are standing in a very dangerous spot, Miss Slater," she said. "Harriet Slater. And I have just been informed that I have nowhere to stand at all, so perhaps the middle of the street is as good a place as any." He looked at her, not in the way that men on the frontier often looked at a woman traveling alone, that particular species of assessment that was part curiosity and part condescension, and part something darker still. He looked at her as though he was reading something important and did not want to miss a word. "That letter," he said, nodding toward the paper in her hand. "Is it from Cornelius Pratt?" She felt the cold thing in her chest move. "You know him." "I know of him," Edgar Keating said carefully, and there was a quality to his carefulness that told her, with a certainty she could not have explained, that this was a man who chose his words with the same deliberation he would choose a path through dangerous territory. "And if that letter says what I think it says, Miss Slater, then you are not the first person he has said it to. And I have been waiting a very long time for someone to walk into this town with enough evidence to make that matter." The freight wagon came through then, and Edgar Keating stepped forward and put a hand at her elbow, not grabbing, not presumptuous, simply directing, the way one directs a person away from the edge of something they cannot yet see. And they stepped up onto the boardwalk together, and Charlie Dunmore's wagon rolled past in a thunder of wheels and horse smell and dust. And that was how it began. Harriet Slater had been born in 1855 in a small town in western Pennsylvania called Glenford, which was the kind of town that exists primarily to remind people why they leave. Her father, Thomas Slater, had been a surveyor by training and a dreamer by nature, and those two qualities had existed in a state of productive tension for the entirety of her childhood. He had taught her to read a compass before she could read a book. He had taught her to take a bearing, to triangulate a position, to understand that north was north regardless of what the ground beneath your feet was doing. He had told her, repeatedly and with great feeling, that the land out west was waiting for people who were willing to do the work of understanding it, and that the Slater family was precisely that kind of people. Thomas Slater had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1877, in the same small house in Glenford where Harriet had been born, and he had died with his hand in hers and the brass compass in his other hand, and a deed to 60 acres in Kansas on the table beside the bed. He had made Harriet promise. He had made her promise to go. She had been 22 years old, and she had looked at her father's face, which was the face of a man who had never once in his life done a cowardly thing, and she had promised. She had spent the following month settling his affairs, which were modest, and preparing for a journey that was not. She had sold the house and most of what was in it. She had packed her trunk with practical things: durable cloth, good boots, a medical kit that a doctor friend of her father's had helped her assemble, the surveying instruments that had been Thomas Slater's most cherished professional possessions. She had kept the compass. She had kept the deed. She had taken the train as far west as the railroad would carry her, and then she had taken the stage the rest of the way. She had arrived in Caldwell on the 4th of July, 1878, which she had taken as a sign. She was wrong about that, but she was right about almost everything else. Edgar Keating had a small office attached to the sheriff's building, and he brought her there with the unassuming efficiency of a man who dealt in problems and preferred to deal with them in private. The office was spare and clean in the way that a man's space is clean when he is disciplined rather than domestic. There was a desk, 2 chairs, a rifle on a rack, a map of Sumner County tacked to the wall with such careful precision that the pins were perfectly level, and a shelf with 3 books on it, which Harriet noticed because she always noticed books. He poured her water from a clay pitcher and set it in front of her and sat down across the desk and held out his hand for the letter. She hesitated. The letter was evidence. She understood instinctively that once she gave it to someone else, she had surrendered a measure of control, and control was something Harriet Slater did not surrender lightly, particularly not to men in positions of institutional authority, whose track record with the interests of women she had studied enough to regard with skepticism. "I am not going to take it from you," Edgar said, reading her hesitation with that same careful attention. "I am going to look at it and give it back. You keep the deed as well, whatever it says." She gave him the letter. He read it slowly. She watched his face while he read, because faces were informative and she had always been good at reading them. His face went through several things: a confirmation, which suggested he had already suspected what it said; an anger which was controlled and banked like a fire somebody had been tending for a long time; and something else, something that she could not quite name, which seemed to be directed at her specifically, at her situation, and which was too warm to be professional sympathy and too restrained to be anything she was ready to name. "Tell me about your father's deed," he said, handing the letter back. She told him. She told him about Thomas Slater and his surveys and his dream, and the agent he had corresponded with 3 years before his death. A man in Caldwell named Pratt, who had advertised parcels of good Kansas farmland in the Pennsylvania newspapers, and who had sent back enthusiastic letters about the quality of the soil, and the proximity to water and the bright future awaiting industrious settlers. She told him about the money Thomas had paid, money he had saved for years, money that had represented every practical sacrifice he had ever made. She told him about the deed that had arrived by post and that she had carried from Pennsylvania to Kansas inside her boot. She did not tell him about the promise. That felt private. That felt like the most private thing she possessed. Edgar listened without interrupting, which was a quality she immediately noted as rare. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Cornelius Pratt has been selling the same parcels to multiple buyers for the past 5 years. He identifies land that is legitimately for sale, often land belonging to estates that are in probate or to owners who are temporarily out of the territory. And he creates duplicate deeds and sells the same parcel to 6, 8, sometimes 10 different people. By the time any of them arrive to claim the land, Pratt has the money and has arranged for the legitimate deed to be registered to a buyer he controls, usually a cattleman named Holt." "Warren Holt," Harriet said. She had seen the name in the letter. "Warren Holt." Edgar's voice was neutral in that careful way again. "He owns approximately a third of the grazing land in Sumner County, and most of it was acquired through Pratt's scheme. Your 60 acres is currently part of a 500-acre parcel that Holt's men are running cattle on. And you have known this," Harriet said, "and you have not stopped it." The words came out without accusation. She was simply establishing a timeline, the way her father had taught her to establish a surveyor's baseline before drawing any conclusions, but she saw him absorb them. "I have known it," he said. "I have been building a case. Sheriff Morrison is not," he stopped. "The sheriff is not inclined to act against Holt. Holt is the biggest employer in this county, and he has the political weight to match. What I have needed is a complainant with documented evidence who is willing to testify. The other victims of Pratt's scheme have been men, and Holt has a way of convincing men that the fight is not worth having." "He will find me less easily convinced," Harriet said. Edgar Keating looked at her then in a way that was wholly different from the way he had looked at her in the street. It was the look of a man who has been working alone for a very long time and has just heard, from an unexpected direction, the sound of someone arriving who speaks his language. "No," he said quietly. "I don't imagine he will." Caldwell in July 1878 was a cattle town at the height of its particular kind of chaos. The long drive from Texas was in full season, and the drovers came through in their hundreds, trail-dusty and trail-hardened, and possessed of the particular recklessness that comes from months of hard riding followed by the sudden proximity of whiskey and money. The main street was a constant procession of horses and wagons and commerce, and the 2 hotels were full, and the saloons were fuller. Harriet found a room at the Caldwell house, which was the more respectable of the 2 hotels, managed by a widow named Mrs. Clara Fenn, who had the brisk competence of a woman who has learned to manage chaos by becoming the calmest thing in it. Mrs. Fenn took one look at Harriet, travel-worn, trunk in hand, with the particular expression of someone who has just been told bad news and has decided to be angry about it rather than defeated, and gave her the room at the end of the upper hall with the window that looked east, toward the Cimarron. "You are not the first young woman to come here alone," Mrs. Fenn said, setting down a lamp on the dresser, "though most of them come for different reasons than whatever yours are. You want supper brought up, or will you come down?" "Down," Harriet said. She had been making herself small for the duration of the journey, staying out of notice in the way that a woman traveling alone in 1878 had to stay out of notice if she wanted to arrive without incident. She was done making herself small. She came down for supper, and Edgar Keating was there. He was eating alone at a corner table with a folder of papers in front of him, and a look of concentrated reading that suggested he had forgotten about the food more than once. He looked up when she came in, and something shifted in his expression, a slight rearrangement that she catalogued without quite knowing what to do with, and he closed the folder. "Miss Slater." He rose slightly. "I did not expect you at dinner." "Where did you expect me?" "Resting," he said. "You have had a difficult day." "I have had a difficult year," she said pleasantly. "A difficult day is just Tuesday." The corner of his mouth moved. It was a very controlled smile, the smile of a man who had learned to be careful about what he let his face do in public, but it was a real one. "Will you sit?" She sat across from him. Mrs. Fenn brought her beef stew and cornbread without being asked, which told Harriet that she had already established some category of person in Mrs. Fenn's assessment, and that the category was not unfavorable. "Tell me about the case you are building," she said. He looked at her. "That is not a dinner conversation. It is for me, and it is for you too, or you would not have your case files on the table." He conceded that with a slight inclination of his head, and then he told her. He told her carefully and completely, the way he did everything, and she listened the same way. Cornelius Pratt had been operating his scheme since at least 1873, possibly earlier. Edgar had identified 9 confirmed victims who had paid for land they never received, and he suspected there were more who had simply cut their losses and gone back east or moved on to other territories without ever filing a complaint. The fraudulent deeds were sophisticated enough to pass casual inspection. Pratt had evidently learned enough about legitimate land survey documents to replicate the form convincingly. What Pratt had not anticipated was a deputy with a surveyor's eye for detail, because Edgar Keating, before the law, had spent 4 years working as a land surveyor for the territorial government. "My father was a surveyor," Harriet said. "I know," said Edgar. "I recognized the instruments in your trunk when the boy at the stage brought your luggage in. Girly transit, good one." She was startled enough to show it. "You looked at my trunk." "I looked at what was on top of it when the boy set it down in the street. The transit case was not quite closed." He paused. "I am sorry. That was observant," she said. "My father would have called it observant." The evening light was coming through the hotel window at a low angle, and it was catching the dust motes in the air and making them look like sparks, and Harriet thought, briefly and with a kind of surprised guilt, that Caldwell was not what she had expected. She had expected blankness. She had expected the frontier as backdrop to her grief and her purpose. She had not expected a man with a surveyor's eye and a folder of case files and a smile that he kept careful watch over, eating supper in the corner of a hotel in Kansas on a July evening, who made her feel, for the first time since her father had died, that north was north and the compass was reliable. She did not say any of that. She was not the kind of woman who said things like that to strangers on the first evening, but she thought it. "Here is what I need from you," Edgar said. He had shifted back into his professional register, and she could feel the effort of it, the slight formality that he put on like a coat. "Your deed, even if it is fraudulent, is evidence of Pratt's method. If you can testify to the circumstances under which your father purchased the land, the correspondence, the payments, the representations Pratt made, it establishes a pattern that I can take to the Federal Land Office in Wichita. I have been building this case without a willing complainant. With one, it changes the legal landscape entirely." "If I am the complainant," Harriet said, "what happens to me, to my position here? Holt is a powerful man. You said as much yourself." "He is," Edgar said. "And I will not pretend otherwise. There is a risk." She had known this before he said it. She had felt the shape of the risk the moment she read Pratt's letter in the street. The question was not whether the risk was real. The question was whether the risk changed what she was going to do. "I came here," she said slowly, "to build something that my father believed in. He believed the frontier was a place where a person could define their own direction. He used to say that a compass does not tell you where to go, it only tells you where north is, and then you choose. I choose to go north on this, Mr. Keating." He was very quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Then let me be useful in that direction." The days that followed were the most productive and the most complicated of Harriet Slater's life, and that was saying something considerable, given the life she had lived. Edgar took her to meet the other people who had been defrauded by Cornelius Pratt. There were 3 of them currently in or near Caldwell. A German family named Bauer who had been farming rented land east of town for a year, while their own land dispute remained unresolved. A former soldier named James Whitmore who had been sleeping in a boarding house and working at the livery, while he tried to understand what had happened to the homestead he had paid for. And a widow from Missouri named Agatha Crane, who had the particular ferocity of a woman who has been wronged and has had time to get very angry about it. Harriet liked Agatha Crane immediately and thoroughly. Agatha was 53 years old and built like a fence post, with iron-gray hair and a mouth that moved from precise courtesy to cutting honesty so fluidly that you were never quite sure which you were going to get. She had been corresponding with Edgar for 6 months about the case, and when Harriet arrived she took one look at her and said, "You are the one with the surveyor father. Good. We need someone who can read the documents." "She can also read the surveys," Edgar said. "Even better," said Agatha. "Sit down and let us talk about Cornelius Pratt." They spent 3 days at Agatha's rented room at the boarding house on Commerce Street, going through Edgar's files and Harriet's copies of her father's correspondence and the Bowers documents and James Whitmore's papers. And what they built was a picture of a fraud so systematic and so deliberate that it took Harriet's breath away, not just for its criminality, but for its architecture. Pratt was not a stupid man. He was a man who had understood the chaos of the frontier land system, the probate delays, the absentee owners, the understaffed federal offices, the sheer volume of transactions that made careful scrutiny nearly impossible, and had built his scheme inside the gaps. He had been, in his criminal way, as good a surveyor of opportunity as Thomas Slater had been of land. "The Federal Land Office is the key," Edgar said on the 3rd evening, when they had spread the documents across Agatha's table in something approaching a coherent timeline. "If I can get a federal land agent out here to examine the original deed records against Pratt's duplicates, it breaks the whole structure. But Sheriff Morrison has blocked every attempt I have made to contact the federal office directly." "How?" Harriet asked. "By sending his own letters first, telling the federal office that the complaints are frivolous and the complainants are transient and unreliable." He said this with a flatness that told her it had cost him something. "Morrison is Holt's man, has been for years. He lets me do my job on the ordinary matters, drunken drovers, petty theft, the daily work, because I do it well and it makes him look competent. But on this, he is Holt's." "Then we go around Morrison," Harriet said. "I do not have the authority." "I do," she said. "I am a private citizen with a documented grievance and a right to petition the federal government directly. Morrison cannot block my mail." She looked at Edgar. "I need you to write the letter with me. You have the legal knowledge. I have the standing." He looked at her for a long moment. Agatha was watching both of them with an expression that was deeply satisfied, as though something she had been expecting was finally happening. James Whitmore, who was a quiet man of careful thought, was staring at the table. The older Bower Carl was nodding slowly. "All right," Edgar said. "We write the letter." It was the writing of the letter, more than anything else in those early days, that changed things between them. They wrote it over 2 evenings at the sheriff's office. Edgar had the authority to use the space when Morrison was absent, which Morrison often was, preferring the company at Holt's ranch to the administration of the town. They wrote carefully and completely, laying out the timeline of the fraud with the specificity that Edgar's legal knowledge required and the clarity that Harriet's practical intelligence supplied. She had grown up watching her father write survey reports, which demanded a particular combination of technical precision and narrative coherence, and she found that she could bring both to this task. What she had not expected was that writing it with Edgar would feel like thinking together. She had written alongside other people before: school, church, the occasional charitable committee work that polite Pennsylvania society required of unmarried daughters. None of it had felt like this. Edgar had a mind that moved in the same direction as hers but often arrived at different angles, and the combination was consistently more useful than either would have been alone. He pushed against her conclusions when he thought they were too broad. She pushed against his when she thought they were too cautious. Neither of them took it personally. Both of them found it, she suspected, surprising. On the 2nd evening it was very late when they finished, the town quiet outside, the oil lamp low, the completed letter on the desk between them. And Harriet was holding the compass, which she had developed the habit of holding when she was thinking hard, and Edgar said, "May I look at it?" She handed it to him. He held it the way a surveyor holds an instrument correctly, not as a curiosity but as a tool, and examined it with the same attention he gave everything. "Your father's, his father's before him," she said. "My grandfather was a surveyor in Pennsylvania before the land was platted. My father said the compass was older than the country." "It's a good one," he said. "Dry card. The pivot is still true." He turned it gently. "He taught you to use it." "He taught me everything he knew. He had no sons, and he was not the kind of man to consider that a reason to withhold knowledge." She paused. "He said the land did not care what gender you were. It only cared if you could read it." Edgar handed the compass back with the kind of care that one uses with things that belong to someone else and carry weight beyond their physical substance. "He sounds like he was a remarkable man." "He was," she said. She was quiet for a moment. "I miss him every single day. But I do not miss him in a way that makes me want to go back. I miss him in a way that makes me want to keep going forward. Does that make sense?" "It makes complete sense," said Edgar Keating. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with that gray-green steadiness that she had been noticing and cataloging and refusing to fully examine for the past week. And she thought, there is something here. She did not say it. She sealed the letter instead and handed it to him to put in the Morning Post, and she took her compass and went back to the Caldwell house and lay on the bed in the room that faced east toward the Cimarron and thought about direction for a long time before she slept. The letter took 11 days to bring a response, and in those 11 days, the situation in Caldwell deteriorated. Cornelius Pratt had not yet been arrested, because Edgar lacked the authority to arrest him on Morrison's watch, but Pratt was aware that something was in motion. Caldwell was not a large town. The fact that the deputy had been meeting with several of Pratt's former victims, including a new arrival from Pennsylvania, was not a secret that the town's gossip economy could maintain for long. On the 8th day after the letter was sent, Harriet came down to breakfast at the Caldwell house to find a note under her door. The note was unsigned. It said, "There is nothing here for you. The sensible thing is to go home." She showed it to Edgar. His jaw tightened in that contained way. "Did anyone see who put it there?" Mrs. Fenn was awake at 5 in the morning, she always is, and she saw a man she did not recognize going up the back stairs. She described him as heavyset with a brown hat. "That is not enormously helpful." "It is Holt's doing," Edgar said. "Or Pratt's. Both of them will have heard about the letter." He paused. Harriet, it was the first time he had used her given name without the formal title, and she felt it like a key turning. "If you want to pull back from this, I will understand it. You did not come here to put yourself in danger. You came here to build something." "I came here to keep a promise," she said, "and I do not break promises." He looked at her with something complicated in his eyes. "No," he said, "I did not think you did." On the 10th day, Warren Holt came to the Caldwell house. He came in the mid-afternoon, which was his power move. It was the hour when the street was hottest and busiest, and most full of the drovers and merchants who constituted his audience. He was a large man of about 50, with the kind of physical authority that comes from size and money, and the long practice of being the most important person in any room. He brought 2 of his ranch hands with him, which was not a threatening gesture overtly, but was understood to be one. Mrs. Fenn came and got Harriet. "There is a gentleman in the parlor asking for you," and I use the word gentleman in the technical rather than the personal sense. Harriet went down. She was wearing her good gray dress. She had changed out of her working clothes when she heard the name, because she believed in the tactical use of appearance, and she had the compass in her pocket and the deed in her bodice, and she had sent a boy to get Edgar before she came down. Holt looked at her and reassessed visibly. She had found in her 23 years that this reassessment was common when men expecting difficulty encountered a young woman in a gray dress with excellent posture. It was a useful moment. "Miss Slater," he said. He had a voice like a slow river, smooth on the surface, strong underneath. "Warren Holt. I own a ranch east of here and quite a bit of the surrounding country, and I believe we have a matter between us worth discussing." "We do," she agreed pleasantly. "Please sit down." He sat. His men stood by the door. Mrs. Fenn was behind the front desk in the adjacent room with the door not quite closed, which Harriet found reassuring. "I understand you have raised a complaint with Deputy Keating regarding a parcel of land east of the Cimarron," Holt said. "I have raised a complaint with the Federal Land Office in Wichita regarding a parcel of land that was fraudulently transferred out of my father's estate," she said, equally pleasantly. "The deputy has been helpful in advising on the process." A slight frost moved across Holt's affability. "Miss Slater, I purchased that land through a registered deed. If there are irregularities in the chain of title, they are not of my doing." "That may be true," she said. "It is also true that Cornelius Pratt, who sold you that land, sold it simultaneously to several other parties, including my father, and that the deed he provided to each of those parties was a duplicate of the original. The Federal Land Office will determine whose deed is legitimate and whose is not. I expect that determination to be thorough. And if it determines that my deed is the legitimate one, then the court will address the question of damages," she said, "which will be Pratt's problem, though I expect you understand that a federal investigation into Pratt's methods will necessarily examine every transaction he conducted, including the ones with you. I expect the results of that examination to be thorough as well." Holt was quiet. The parlor was very warm. From the street outside came the sounds of Caldwell in full afternoon, horses, voices, the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer. "You are a long way from home," Holt said, and the river in his voice had an edge to it now. "A young woman alone on the frontier, no family, no property. That is a vulnerable position." The door opened and Edgar Keating came in. He did not hurry. He came through the door at his ordinary pace with his badge on his vest and his hat in his hand, and he looked at Holt and Holt's men and at Harriet, and he said, "Mr. Holt, I did not expect to find you here." "I came to speak to Miss Slater," Holt said. "And now you have spoken to her," Edgar said. "I trust the conversation was satisfactory." The two men looked at each other. Harriet, who had been watching confrontations between men of unequal institutional power all her life. She had grown up in a town where the mine owner had the same quality of gravity that Holt had recognized, the particular kind of standoff that is resolved not by what is said, but by what both parties understand about what the other will and will not do. Holt understood, she thought, that Edgar was not the kind of man who would be moved. And Edgar understood that Holt was not stupid enough to make a move that could be witnessed by a hotel full of people. "Good afternoon, Miss Slater," Holt said. He rose. He was controlled. She would give him that. "I hope you find what you are looking for in Caldwell." "I already have," she said. And then she was surprised by her own words, because she had meant the land, the case, the justice for her father's dream, but standing in the light of the parlor window with the sound of Edgar's steady breathing behind her, she was not entirely sure that was all she meant. The response from the Federal Land Office arrived on the 12th day. It was not quite what they had hoped for, and it was not quite what they had feared. The federal agent, a man named Graves, who was apparently meticulous and politically difficult to lean on, which was either fortunate or the result of Edgar's specific choice of recipient. She suspected the latter wrote that he was commencing an investigation into the land transactions conducted through Cornelius Pratt's office, but that it would take time, and that in the interim all transfers were frozen. He would arrive in Caldwell within 3 weeks. "Frozen transfers," Harriet said. "That means Holt cannot sell or develop the disputed land. It also means you cannot register a new claim while the investigation is ongoing," Edgar said. He was watching her face. "I know that is not what you wanted. It is what the situation requires," she said. 3 weeks is a reasonable wait. What happens between now and then?" What happened between now and then was that Caldwell showed Harriet Slater its other faces. She had arrived seeing it as an obstacle, a place where her dream had been blocked, and where she would have to fight before she could build. She had not expected to find it interesting on its own terms. But she was her father's daughter, which meant she could not encounter new territory without wanting to understand it. She spent mornings with Edgar, working through the remaining case files and preparing for the federal agent's arrival. She spent afternoons exploring the town and its immediate surroundings with the thoroughness that was her father's greatest professional gift. She took the Gurley Transit out of its case and did survey work on the 2 parcels adjacent to the contested 60 acres, partly because it was useful and partly because surveying was how she thought, how she processed the world, how she made sense of space and relation and possibility. Edgar came out with her the first time she took the transit out. He watched her set it up with a combination of professional recognition and personal admiration that he kept carefully in check, but that she could read as clearly as a survey line. "You are good," he said when she had taken her third bearing with the fluency of long practice. "I have been doing it since I was 12, she said. "My father started me on a smaller instrument. I graduated to the transit when I was 15. He said the best way to learn to read land was to measure it." "He was right," Edgar said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "I have not done survey work in 3 years. I miss it." She looked at him. The afternoon sun was strong and behind him, and his hat was casting a shadow across his face, and there was something in the line of his shoulders that she had not seen before, a wistfulness, the shape of a man who has given up something he loved for something he felt was necessary. "Why did you stop?" she asked. "To take the deputy's position. To be here when this case was ready," he said simply. "I had been working for the Territorial Survey, and I found the first evidence of Pratt's fraud, a survey discrepancy in a deed he had filed in 1874. I knew it would take time to build a case. I needed to be here to build it. The deputyship was the best way to stay." She set down the transit rod and looked at him directly. "You have been working on this for 4 years. "Yes." "And before I arrived, you had been unable to get a complainant willing to testify." "Yes." "So you waited," she said. "You gave up the work you loved and you stayed in a town where your superior is corrupt and you waited for 4 years because it was right." He looked uncomfortable in the way of a man who does not enjoy being observed being good. "Someone had to." "Edgar," she said. He looked at her. It was the first time she had used his given name without the formal title, and she felt the same key turning that she had heard in his voice 11 days ago, but this time it was hers, and she could see from his face that he felt it too. "Thank you," she said. "My father would have." She stopped, tried again. "He would have been grateful. I am grateful, not just for my case, for all of them, for what it cost you." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "You are going to stay here, aren't you, after this is settled?" It was not quite a question and not quite a hope and not quite a statement, and she thought about all three before she answered. "I came here to build something," she said. "The direction was always here. I just needed to find the path." She looked out across the flat Kansas landscape, the long dry grass, the enormous sky, the distant line of the Cimarron. "Yes, I am going to stay." He nodded. His face did the thing it did, that careful rearrangement that controlled what showed, but something got through the control this time. She filed it in the catalog she had been keeping, under a heading she had not yet written but was beginning to see the shape of. The weeks before the federal agent arrived were not peaceful. Sheriff Morrison, who had apparently been fully briefed by Holt on the contents of the letter to the federal office, and was furious about what he considered Edgar's insubordination, called Edgar into his office and told him that if he continued to actively build a case against Pratt without Morrison's authorization, he would be discharged from his position. Edgar came back from that meeting with his face set and his hands at his sides and went directly to his desk and sat down. Harriet was there. She had been going through one of the deed documents with a magnifying glass, checking the survey notation against the legitimate survey records Edgar had obtained from the county seat. She looked up. "He threatened your position," she said. "Yes." "And," he looked at her. "And nothing. The letter to the federal office is already sent. The federal agent is already coming. Morrison cannot unwrite that. What he can do is fire me, and if he fires me, I will become a private citizen with access to all the files I have been building for 4 years, and with no institutional obligation to wait for his permission to do anything." She felt something shift in her chest, warm and complicated and slightly alarming. "That is either the bravest thing I have ever heard or the most reckless." "Probably both," he said, and there was the smile again, controlled and real, and she thought, "There it is. That is the thing I have been cataloging. That is the thing I have not yet let myself name." She named it that evening, quietly and privately, lying in the room that faced east. She lay with the compass on the pillow beside her, the way she had laid it every night since she left Pennsylvania, and she thought, "I am falling in love with Edgar Keating." She thought it with the same clarity with which she took a survey bearing, simply and without drama, as though naming a true north. She did not know what to do with it yet, but she knew it. The federal agent, Augustus Graves, arrived on the 22nd day. He was a small, precise man in his 40s with the humorless thoroughness of someone who had spent his career in the federal bureaucracy, not because he loved paperwork, but because he loved accuracy, and he had very little patience for either corruption or incompetence. He arrived on the afternoon stage, went directly to the land office, asked for the original deed records for the Eastern Cimarron parcels, and within 45 minutes had found 3 discrepancies that confirmed Edgar's analysis. Edgar had been right. Harriet had been right. Thomas Slater had been robbed. The formal process that followed was neither swift nor simple, but it was inexorable. Graves filed his preliminary finding within 2 days of arrival. Morrison, recognizing that the federal government's involvement made his position untenable, attempted to distance himself from both Holt and Pratt with the speed of a man abandoning a burning building. He issued a statement supporting the investigation that was so blatant a reversal that even the cattlemen who had previously supported him recognized it as the political survival maneuver it was. Cornelius Pratt was arrested on the 3rd day after Graves's arrival by Edgar Keating in front of the land office in the full sight of the main street. Harriet was there. She had not planned to be, but she had been walking past with Agatha Crane on the way to the land surveyors at the county end of town, and she stopped on the boardwalk and watched Edgar put the handcuffs on Pratt with the calm efficiency of a man who has been waiting 4 years for a moment and intends to do it correctly. Pratt looked at her. He did not know her by sight, but something in her expression must have told him something, because he looked at her with the particular bitterness of a man who has identified the origin of his unraveling. She held his gaze steadily. She thought of Thomas Slater. She thought of the winter of 1877 and her father's hand in hers and the deed on the table beside the bed. She thought of the compass. Then she let Pratt go from her attention because he was no longer worth it, and she turned to Agatha, and Agatha was smiling the way iron smiles, without softening and with complete satisfaction. "Well," said Agatha Crane, "there is that." Warren Holt's situation took longer to resolve, as large things always do. His attorney argued that his purchase of the land had been made in good faith, which was technically possible but practically implausible given the volume of Pratt's transactions and Holt's evident foreknowledge of the scheme. Graves's investigation expanded. More documents came to light. The process moved through the federal courts with the slow certainty of something that has enough evidence to be patient. In the end, the court found against Holt on 4 of the 9 disputed parcels, including Harriet's 60 acres on the East Cimarron. The land was returned to the legitimate deed holders. The other 5 parcels were the subject of damage awards paid against Pratt's assets, which were considerable once they were found, because a man who has been running a fraud for 5 years and investing the proceeds does not run it in poverty. All of this took until late September 1878. By then, Harriet had been in Caldwell for nearly 3 months, and in those 3 months, a great deal had happened that had nothing to do with the case. The morning after Pratt's arrest, Edgar came to the Caldwell house for breakfast and found Harriet already at the corner table with the map of the 60 acres spread in front of her, and a pencil making small, precise notations at the margins. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she looked up, and she caught him standing there with an expression that he had not had time to compose before she saw it open in a way that his face was not usually open, unguarded in a way that told her, with the accuracy of a compass bearing, where she stood. She felt the warmth of it move through her, and then she smiled, which was something she did not always do freely, and he came across the room and sat down and looked at the map. "You have been thinking about what to build," he said. "I have been thinking about what was there before it needs to be built," she said. "The parcel is 60 acres on the river bend. My father's original survey notes describe it as good bottomland with a reliable water source and enough elevation at the north end to site a house without flood risk. I want to do a proper survey before I decide anything. I want to know the land the way he intended to know it." "I can help with that," Edgar said, and then more quietly, "if you want." "I want," she said. They surveyed the 60 acres over 3 days in mid-August. They went out each morning at first light and came back each evening at dusk, and in between they worked the land with instruments and measuring chains, and the careful precision of people who know how to listen to what a landscape is telling them. Edgar had not done survey work in 3 years, but his skills had not gone anywhere. They were simply waiting, the way skills do when they belong to a person's nature rather than just their practice. It was the best 3 days of Harriet Slater's life. Not because of the land, though the land was everything her father had said it would be, the bottomland rich and deep, the river bend providing a natural water source of the kind that made farming viable in a way that dry prairie could not, the elevation at the north end exactly as Thomas's survey notes had described it. Not even because of the quality of the work, though the work was good. It was the best 3 days because of what she and Edgar found out about each other while they were doing it. They found out that they argued about technique with a kind of relish that neither of them usually permitted themselves. Edgar preferring his own method of calculating offset distances, Harriet preferring her father's, both methods being correct, the argument being entirely unnecessary and entirely enjoyable. They found out that they both had the habit of going silent when something in the landscape surprised them. A bird, an unexpected change in soil color, the quality of light at certain hours, and that the silences were comfortable in a way that other silences rarely were. They found out that Edgar knew the names of most of the birds in this part of Kansas, and that Harriet knew the geological history of most of the rock formations along the Cimarron, and that these 2 bodies of knowledge were more complementary than either had expected. They found out, on the second evening, sitting on the high bank at the north end of the parcel watching the light die in the west over the grass, that they were both people who had made large sacrifices for things they believed in, and who had done so without complaint and without the expectation of recognition, and that meeting someone who had done the same thing was a particular kind of relief. "I was engaged once," Edgar said. "It came out of a silence, not from nowhere but from somewhere in the quality of the evening that made honest things easy. Before I came here, in Ohio, she was a good woman. She wanted a settled life, and I could not give her what a settled life looked like then." Harriet held the compass in her lap and watched the grass move in the evening breeze. "What did it look like then?" "A comfortable house in a comfortable town where the biggest difficulty was whether the river flooded in spring," he said. "She was not wrong to want it. I was wrong to think I could give it. I should not have gotten as far as engaged before I understood that." "How long ago?" 6 years. I was 24, young enough to be foolish and old enough to know I should not have been." He was quiet. "She married a banker in Columbus the following year. I expect she is very content." "I expect she is," Harriet said, not without warmth. "I was never engaged. I was nearly courted twice, both times by men who were substantially more interested in the fact that I was a surveyor's daughter with education than they were in me as a person. I found it fairly easy to end." "Were you ever," he stopped, started again. "Was there ever anyone who interested you the way those did not?" She turned to look at him. The light was low and golden and the grass was moving, and he was looking back at her with that gray-green steadiness, and she thought, north is north. The compass does not tell you where to go, you choose. There is now, she said. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have said something true and are allowing it to settle into the landscape of what is now known, the way you let a survey point settle before you take your reading. Harriet, he said. Edgar, she said. And then, because they were both practical people who understood that acknowledgement is not the same as decision, and because the light was nearly gone and the walk back to town was long, she stood up and said, "We should go back. We have one more day of survey work tomorrow and I want to be out here at first light." He stood. He was close. The evening was warm and the grass smelled of late summer and the river below them was making its quiet sound, and he put his hand against her face, gently, briefly, the way he did everything with deliberateness and care, and then let it go. "First light," he said. They went back to town in the gathering dark, and the compass in Harriet's pocket pointed north all the way, and she thought of her father, and she thought of direction, and she thought that the 60 acres on the East Cimarron Bend was the most right place she had ever been. September arrived with the case nearing its resolution, and with Caldwell settling into the rhythms of the post-summer season. The cattle drives winding down, the drovers heading back south, the town finding its quieter self beneath the noise it had been making since spring. Harriet stayed at the Caldwell house and worked the land when the legal process allowed it, and helped Agatha and the Bowers and James Whitmore with their own claims. She and Edgar had not spoken again in the direct way they had spoken on the river bank. But things had shifted between them in the way that things shift after an honest word. The ground was the same, but the light was different, and they both moved through it aware of the difference. He came to the hotel for breakfast most mornings. She went to the office most afternoons. They worked together with the ease of people who have been doing it for months and who have stopped needing to arrange for it. It simply happened, the way water finds its level. Mrs. Fenn noticed. Mrs. Fenn, who had been widowed at 32 and had spent the subsequent 12 years running a hotel on the Kansas frontier and observing human nature at close quarters, had noticed approximately 2 weeks after Harriet arrived. She said nothing about it. She simply began keeping the parlor fire going a little longer on the evenings when Edgar was there. Agatha Crane was less subtle. On the afternoon that Graves announced his preliminary finding, sitting in the land office with Harriet and Edgar, and all three of the other victims gathered to hear the result, she leaned over to Harriet and said, very quietly, "He looks at you the way my late husband looked at me, and if you are not aware of it, you are the only person in this room who is not." Harriet was aware of it. She had been aware of it with a precision that she could have mapped. The formal resolution of the land case came on the 21st of September, 1878. Harriet Slater became the registered owner of 60 acres on the East Cimarron Bend, deed properly filed with the Federal Land Office in Wichita and registered in the Sumner County Deed Book. She had the deed in her hand, standing outside the county clerk's office, and she held the compass in the other hand, both of them at once, for a long moment. Edgar was beside her. "Well," she said. Her voice was steady. She was not going to weep in the street. She had made that decision in advance. She did weep, but only a little and only for a moment, and she looked at the compass the whole time because it was her father's and it was right. "Well, I suppose I have to build a house now." "I suppose you do," Edgar said. He was smiling, not the controlled smile, but the full one, the one she had only seen a handful of times and which made something in her chest do complicated things. "Will you need help with the foundation plan?" "Probably," she said. She looked up at him. "I will probably need quite a lot of help, for a very long time." The pause was not long. They were both people who moved from understanding to decision without excessive delay once they were sure of the understanding. "I have been in love with you," Edgar Keating said, "since you stood in the middle of the main street reading that letter and did not shake." She laughed, actually laughed, with a freedom she had not heard in her own voice for a very long time. "I have been in love with you," she said, "since you handed back my father's compass like it was worth more than everything else on the desk." He took her hand. In the middle of the street, in the September sun, in Caldwell, Kansas, in the year 1878, with the deed in one hand and the compass in the other, Harriet Slater let Edgar Keating take her hand and felt, for the first time since her father had died, that she was standing on ground that was entirely, reliably, permanently hers. They did not rush what came next. They were not rushing people. Harriet had a house to build and land to break and plans to make, and Edgar had a case still winding through its final legal processes, and a conversation with Sheriff Morrison to have about the nature of his continued employment, which went exactly as well as expected. Morrison did not fire him, because firing him would have confirmed to the federal office that Morrison had been obstructing the case, and Morrison was not bold enough for that, and a great deal of ordinary daily work besides. But they moved through the autumn together, and the moving together was the thing. He helped her with the foundation for the house on the north end of the parcel. She helped him draft the final report for the federal case. He taught her which parts of the Kansas sky meant weather and which meant empty threat. She taught him the survey notation her father had developed for recording soil quality, which was more comprehensive than the standard method. They walked the 60 acres on Sunday mornings when the weather permitted, and she told him what she was going to do with each part of it. The bottomland would be kitchen garden and orchard, the flat eastern portion field grain, the slope below the north bank a kitchen herb garden because she had grown up with fresh herbs and refused to cook without them. He listened with the same full attention that he gave everything, and occasionally added something practical, where the drainage would be a problem in spring, where the wind came from in November, what the winter would look like from inside those walls. In October, he kissed her for the first time. They were standing at the surveyor's pin she had driven at the northwest corner of the parcel on their first day of survey work, which was a corner she had been coming back to regularly because the light hit it in a particular way in the late afternoon, and she had just finished telling him the final measurements for the house footprint, and he looked at the numbers, and then at her, and then simply did it. Without excess deliberation, but without haste, the way he did the things he had decided were right. She kissed him back with equal deliberateness and considerably less restraint than she had maintained for the preceding 3 months, because she had been exercising considerable restraint for 3 months and she was ready to stop. When they separated, he was looking at her with that open expression that she had been watching develop over months, the one that let the gray-green through without the control. "Harriet," he said. "Edgar," she said, "you are going to ask me to marry you, aren't you?" "I was working up to it," he said, with slight wounded dignity. "You have been working up to it for 3 months," she said fondly. "I would hate for you to lose the moment to logistics." He laughed. It was, she decided, her favorite sound that the frontier had yet produced. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said without hesitation or qualification, the way she said things she was completely sure of. "Yes, I will." They were married in Caldwell on the 15th of November, 1878, at the small Methodist church on the south end of town. It was a cold, clear day with a sky the exact shade of the inside of a mussel shell, and the church was fuller than expected because Caldwell, which had been watching the whole story of Harriet Slater and Edgar Keating unfold over 4 months with the attentive interest that small towns bestow on everything interesting that happens within them, had decided collectively that this was an event worth attending. Agatha Crane stood with Harriet. James Whitmore stood with Edgar. The Bauer family occupied an entire pew, and Carl Bauer wept freely, which he explained afterward was because he was German and this was what Germans did at weddings, and no one disputed him. Mrs. Fenn sat in the front row and looked satisfied in the way of a woman who has watched a thing develop from the beginning and has been consistently right about it. The minister, a young man from Ohio named Reverend Cole, who had been in Caldwell only since August and who was still somewhat overwhelmed by the category of events the frontier produced, read the ceremony with careful sincerity, and Edgar Keating and Harriet Slater said their vows to each other in the plain, complete way that both of them did everything that mattered. When it was done, when they were standing outside the church in the cold November air with the town around them and the wide Kansas sky above them, Edgar reached into his coat pocket and produced a small box. In it was a ring, a simple gold band with a small chip of blue-gray stone that matched, almost exactly, the color of his eyes. "It is Montana sapphire," he said. "I sent to Wichita for it. I know it is not the fashion, it is perfect," she said. She put it on. She held her hand next to the compass, both of them glinting in the November light, and felt something in her settle finally, completely, into place. "I want to show you something," he said. He led her around the back of the church to where a horse and buggy were waiting. His horse, a steady bay gelding named Wilson, who was the most dependable animal she had ever met, and they drove east out of town together. And she knew where they were going before they arrived because there was only one place east of Caldwell that was hers. But when they pulled up to the north end of the parcel, she saw what he had done. The foundation was poured. The walls of the house were framed rough timber, not finished, but the shape of it clear in the late afternoon light, the skeleton of the thing she had described to him over weeks of Sunday mornings. The chimney position was marked. The door faced south, and the window positions were exactly where she had said they should be, one on each cardinal point, so that from inside you could always see in every direction. She got down from the buggy and walked into the frame of the house, just the frame, cold timber and the sky above, and stood in the center of what would be the main room and turned slowly, and through the open window spaces she could see north and south and east and west, and in every direction there was Kansas being its enormous, indifferent, magnificent self. Edgar came and stood beside her. She held the compass out, flat on her palm between them. "My father said a compass does not tell you where to go," she said. "It only tells you where north is, and then you choose." "And you chose well," he said softly. He said she stopped, tried again, her voice was steady. He said that the right direction was always the one that was true, that if you were honest about what you were and what you needed and where you were going, the compass would confirm it, but you had to be the one to choose. "And have you found the right direction?" Edgar asked. She turned and looked at her husband, at the gray-green eyes and the careful mouth, and the hands that held instruments like tools rather than toys, and that held other things, important things, with the same combination of strength and gentleness. And she thought of Thomas Slater, who had given her every useful thing she had ever owned, including the ability to stand on her own ground and know it for what it was. "I have found the right one," she said. He covered her hand and the compass both with his own, and they stood in the skeleton of their house on the 60 acres of the East Cimarron Bend, and the compass pointed north, and the sky went on forever in every direction, and it was exactly right. The house was finished by March of 1879. They moved into it in the last week of the month, when the Kansas spring was arriving with its characteristic abruptness, one day gray and frozen, and the next green and windy, and full of the smell of the earth waking. Harriet had planned the interior with the same precision she brought to survey work, and the result was a house that was deeply functional and unexpectedly beautiful. Every room oriented to light and air and use, the kitchen south-facing for warmth, the bedroom east-facing for morning light, the small room at the north end that would serve as a study and surveying workroom containing a desk large enough for 2 people. Edgar had kept the deputy position. Morrison had retired in January, pressured by the federal government into doing so as part of the terms of the investigation's conclusion, and the new sheriff, a man from Wichita named Patterson who had been recommended by Augustus Graves, had asked Edgar to stay on as senior deputy. Edgar had said yes, with the understanding that he could also take private survey work on a case-by-case basis, which Patterson had agreed to. The arrangement suited him, and it suited Harriet, who had her own survey work to do. The 60 acres needed a proper final survey registered with the county, and there were 2 neighboring farms whose owners had asked her to do boundary work for them at rates that would have insulted Thomas Slater's colleagues in Pennsylvania, and were entirely reasonable for Kansas in 1879. The work was good, and the land was good, and the house was good, and Harriet Slater, who was now Harriet Keating, she kept both names, using Slater for professional purposes in honor of her father, which Edgar had thought was entirely right and had said so immediately, found that the frontier was everything her father had promised it would be. Not easy, not kind in the way that soft things are kind, but true and honest and rewarding in exact proportion to what you brought to it. In the spring evenings, when the day's work was done, and the house was warm with the fire they still needed in March, she and Edgar would sit at the large desk in the north room with the survey maps and the deed files and the case papers. And sometimes they would work, and sometimes they would talk, and sometimes they would simply be in the same room in the productive silence of two people who are at home with each other, and with the world they have built together. She kept the compass on the desk between them. He had never asked her to put it away or to set it aside, and she had noticed that, and it had mattered. Agatha Crane had stayed in Caldwell. Her land parcel, the 40 acres she had paid for and never received, on the south side of town, had been restored to her by the court's ruling, and she had sold it, because she had no desire to farm, and used the proceeds to buy a boarding house on Commerce Street, which she ran with the brisk decisiveness of someone who has been wronged once and has decided that her own competence is her best protection. She came to supper at the Keating house on the first Sunday of every month, and Harriet looked forward to those evenings more than almost anything, because Agatha was one of those people whose company made you sharper and more honest, which was the best thing company could do. James Whitmore had also stayed, which surprised people who had assumed he would move on to more open territory. He had taken work as a surveyor's assistant for Harriet, in fact, as she found the volume of her survey work increasing through the spring and summer of 1879, and he had discovered that he had a talent for it, which was one of those pleasant frontier surprises that the territory occasionally produced. He was a quiet, steady man of 30 who moved with the economy of someone who has learned to be useful in hard circumstances, and he and Harriet worked well together in the field. The Bowers had gone north to their parcel, which was 30 acres on the Little Arkansas, and Carl Bower had written Harriet a letter in March that was formally polite and warmly German, and concluded with the phrase that she and Mr. Keating were people of the good kind that the West needs more of, which she had showed Edgar, and which he had kept in his desk drawer. The summer of 1879 was the summer that things expanded in all directions. Harriet's survey business grew past what she had anticipated. The homestead rush that was beginning to transform the territory, the combination of the Homestead Act, the increasing reach of the railroads, and the general westward movement of a population that had been building toward the frontier for decades meant that there was more survey work in Sumner County than the existing surveyors could handle. She had credentials and skill and reputation, and by July she had more work than she and James Whitmore could manage alone. Edgar continued his deputy work and took on survey contracts of his own, and they had the interesting experience of being professional competitors on certain jobs and professional collaborators on others, which was a situation that might have been uncomfortable with different people, and was, for them, simply another form of the conversation they had been having since the beginning. They debated methods over supper. They shared clients when the work required it. They drove out together when the morning allowed it, and came back in the evening with the day in them. One evening in late July, Harriet came in from a long day of field work on the western edge of the county, a boundary dispute between two homesteaders that had required considerable diplomatic as well as technical skill, and found Edgar at the north desk with a letter in his hand, and an expression on his face that she could not immediately read. "What is it?" she said, pouring herself water and sitting down. He handed her the letter. It was from Augustus Graves at the Federal Land Office in Wichita. It contained a formal offer, the position of Federal Land Survey Supervisor for Sumner County, to be established as part of a new federal initiative to regularize land records in the post-frontier territories. The position would require coordinating all survey work in the county, maintaining the official records, and supervising a small staff. It also paid 3 times what his deputy position paid. She read it twice. Then she looked up. "It is for you," she said. "He is offering it to you." "He is offering it to me," Edgar confirmed, "which means I would need to leave the sheriff's office." "You have been wanting to leave the sheriff's office since Morrison's time," she said. "Patterson is better, but the work is not what you love." "No," he said, but he stopped. There was something careful in his face that told her this was not actually about his own uncertainty. "Edgar," she said. He looked at her directly. "It would mean significant authority over the county's land records, including all the records of deeds currently under your survey contracts and James's. It would mean I would need to be careful about conflict of interest with your practice." "Because you are my husband," she said. "Because I am your husband and your colleague, and because the last thing I want is for anyone to be able to question the integrity of either of our work." She was quiet for a moment. She understood what he was doing. He was protecting her reputation and her professional standing by raising the question before the question could be raised from outside. It was exactly the thing she would have done for him. "Then we establish it clearly from the beginning," she said. "Any contracts that I or James hold are formally recused from your review and assigned to the territorial supervisor in Wichita. It will mean slightly more paperwork for both of us and no practical impediment to either of our work. The conflict of interest question has a standard administrative answer, and we use it." He looked at her. "You thought about this already." "I thought about it while you were deciding whether to mention it," she said. "Take the position, Edgar. You have been building toward something like it since you left the territorial survey. This is the right direction." He accepted the position in August. The transition was smooth, because Edgar was a man who managed transitions smoothly by preparing for them thoroughly. And by September, he was established in the Federal Land Supervisor's office in a newly fitted space in the county government building, with 2 junior surveyors under his direction, and a mandate to create the most accurate and comprehensive land record system Sumner County had ever possessed. Which meant that he spent his days doing the work he loved. Which meant that he came home in the evenings with a quality of satisfaction in his face that she had not seen there in the early months, not the banked patience of a man who was enduring, but the real fullness of a man who was doing what he was built for. She noticed this every day. She was glad of it every day. She did not tell him every day, because she was not that kind of person, but she told him regularly, and he received it in the way he received everything from her, directly and without deflection, and with an honesty in return that she had come to regard as the most valuable thing she had ever been given. On a morning in October 1879, exactly 1 year after he had first kissed her at the Northwest Survey Pin, she came into the north workroom where he was already at the desk, map spread in front of him, coffee going cold at his elbow the way it always did when he was working, and she said, "I need to tell you something." He looked up from the map. She told him. He was very still for a moment. Then he rose from the desk and came around to her and took both her hands in both of his, compass and all, and he looked at her with the open face, the unguarded face, the one she had been cataloging since the first week in Caldwell. "Harriet," he said. "March," she said. "Mrs. Fenn says March from the way I have been feeling. She has considerable experience with this." "Mrs. Fenn knows?" he asked, slightly thrown. "Mrs. Fenn knew before I was certain," Harriet said. "She is extremely observant." He laughed, and then he held her, and she leaned against him with the compass between them and the map of Sumner County on the desk and the October light coming through the east-facing window, and the house was warm and the land outside it was theirs. Thomas Edgar Keating was born in March of 1880, on a cold, clear morning when the ground was still hard, and the sky was the color of winter giving up rather than spring arriving. He was born at home, because the nearest doctor was 30 miles away, and Mrs. Fenn had delivered a dozen babies in her years on the frontier, and had a competence about it that Harriet trusted more than distance. Edgar was present throughout, which was not standard for the time but was characteristic of who he was. He was not a man who stepped back from hard things, and he was not a man who believed that being present was optional when something mattered. Harriet held their son in the first hour and looked at him, the particular astonished wonder of looking at a person who did not exist yesterday, and felt the weight of him and the reality of him, and thought of Thomas Slater, who had held her the same way in 1855 in a small house in Pennsylvania, and had pressed a compass into her hand when she was old enough to understand direction. "Thomas," she said. "Thomas," Edgar agreed. The boy had gray-green eyes from the first weeks. Harriet found this deeply pleasing. Edgar pretended not to notice that it pleased her and noticed everything. The spring of 1880 was the spring that the frontier did what the frontier did. It changed around them while they were building their lives in it. The Kansas homestead rush was intensifying. New towns were appearing on the plains to the west. The railroad was extending its reach. The old cattle drive economy that had made Caldwell famous was beginning to shift as barbed wire and homesteaders transformed the open range. And the conflicts that arose from that transformation were the daily material of Edgar's work at the land office and of Harriet's in the field. She continued to work through the spring, through the early summer, taking James Whitmore with her on the longer field days, and managing the shorter surveys herself with the ease of someone who has been doing this work for years. Thomas came to the field with her in a carrier when he was small enough for that to be practical, bundled against the Kansas wind, and she would talk to him while she worked, explaining the instruments and the measurements in the way her father had talked to her, because she believed children absorbed more than people gave them credit for. Edgar laughed at her for this. "He is 4 months old," he said. "My father started teaching me at 4 months," she said. "Or close enough. You were not 4 months old when your father started teaching you to survey." "I was 4 months old when he started talking to me about it," she said firmly. "And I have an excellent understanding of survey notation, so the method was clearly sound." He conceded the argument because he could see the justice of it, and because he had learned, in the 18 months of their marriage, that conceding the arguments he lost was both more efficient and more honest than pretending otherwise. The summer of 1880 was long and hot and full of work. The county was growing. Edgar's office was handling more deed registrations per week than it had handled per month when Morrison had been in charge, and the accuracy and transparency of the records under Edgar's supervision were already becoming a kind of quiet reputation. Neighboring counties were beginning to look at Sumner County's land office as a model. He had hired a third junior surveyor and was training him in the particular thoroughness that he required, which was the thoroughness of a man who had once spent 4 years watching what happened when land records were handled carelessly or corruptly. Harriet's practice had grown to the point where she was being contacted by homesteaders from as far west as Dodge City, which was not close enough to travel to easily, but was flattering in its indication of reputation. She had been asked twice to write articles for the Kansas Farmer about survey methods for homestead claims, and she had written both with the crisp informational clarity of her father's professional voice, and they had been reprinted in 2 other territorial papers, and she had received letters from women in Colorado and Nebraska who were doing similar work and who had found it useful. She answered every letter. She believed in answering letters. On a September evening in 1880, Harriet and Edgar sat on the south steps of their house in the last of the day's heat, with Thomas sleeping in the house behind them, and the Cimarron making its quiet sound below the north bank, and the stars coming out one by one in the long Kansas twilight. She was holding the compass, turned face up on her palm, and the needle was pointing north as it always did. "My father said once," she said, "that he wanted to see the frontier before it was settled. That there was something about a place before it was finished that was worth knowing." "He was right," Edgar said. He was leaning against the porch post with his arms folded, looking west where the last light was still a thread of orange above the flat horizon, And there is also something about a place after the people who belong to it arrive, a different kind of rightness. Do you feel it? She asked. That we belong here. He turned his head and looked at her. Thomas Edgar Keating, his son, was asleep 10 feet away. His wife was holding her father's compass and looking at him with the steady, clear eyes that had been looking at him honestly since the 4th of July, 1878, in the middle of the main street of Caldwell. I feel it every day, he said. She looked at the compass. The needle was true. The autumn brought a letter from Agatha Crane, who had sold the boarding house on Commerce Street and was moving, at 55 years old, with the casual boldness of a woman who has learned that age is not a reason to stop, to Colorado Territory, where a friend of hers was establishing a women's rights society that Agatha apparently felt needed someone with her particular qualities of organization and confrontation. The letter was warm and funny, and told Harriet that she was proud of her in terms that Agatha clearly found sentimental but had decided to include anyway, and that Edgar was a good man, and that the son sounded excellent, and that she expected a letter when the next one arrived. Harriet wrote back immediately and at length and put the letter to Agatha in the envelope with as much warmth as Harriet Keating was able to contain in written form, which was considerable. James Whitmore, who was 31 now and had been quietly and steadily in love with the daughter of the post office manager for 6 months, proposed to her in October. Her name was Dora Reeves, and she was 24, and had the kind of practical good sense that recognized a steady man when it presented itself. She said yes. They were married in November, which made it 2 November weddings in 2 years associated with Harriet's survey practice, which Edgar said was either a coincidence or the most effective advertising she had done. The winter of 1880 to 1881 was the winter that Harriet discovered she was carrying again. She told Edgar in December, beside the fire in the north workroom, with Thomas asleep in the bedroom, and the deed map spread on the desk, and the compass at its usual position between the inkwell and the lamp. He took a different kind of breath this time, not surprised, because they were not people to whom surprises came easily, but deep and deliberate, the breath of someone receiving something large. How do you feel? He asked. Good, she said. Better than last time at this point. Mrs. Fenn says that is either a good sign or meaningless, and she cannot tell which until March. Summer, then, he said. Late July, she said, if Mrs. Fenn's calendar is right. He came around the desk and sat beside her rather than across from her, which was something he did sometimes, changed the geometry of the conversation when the conversation needed it. He took her hand. Outside, the Kansas winter was making its case, wind against the west walls, and inside the house was warm and the lamp was steady and the compass needle was pointing north. I want to tell you something, he said. She looked at him. I think about your father quite often, he said, which is, he paused, selecting his words with that care she loved. I know that sounds odd given that I never met him. It does not sound odd, she said. I think about what he understood when he sent you here. Not just the land. He knew you well enough to know that the frontier was the right place for you. That the kind of person you are needs room to be that person, and that the frontier gives that in a way that settled places do not always. He paused again. And I am grateful to him, every day, for sending you in this direction. She was quiet for a long moment. She held the compass in her free hand and looked at it, and thought of Thomas Slater, his voice, his hands on the transit, his face in the lamplight of the surveying table when she was 12, and just beginning to understand what it meant to know where north was. He would have liked you, she said. He would have liked that you read his survey notes before you ever met me. He would have liked that you gave the compass back as though it mattered. He would have liked that you waited 4 years for the thing that was right. She looked at Edgar. He was that kind of man. Then I am grateful to be the kind of man he would have liked, Edgar said. She leaned against him in the way she did in the evenings, not dramatically, not with excess. And the fire was steady, and the compass was between them and the land outside was theirs. 60 acres and a house and a baby asleep in the next room, and another coming in July, and a survey practice growing, and a federal office running well, and the frontier doing what it always did, which was being large and difficult and endlessly honest. Clara Josephine Keating was born in July of 1881, on a hot morning, with a thunderstorm coming from the west that broke before noon and cooled the house to something bearable. She was dark-haired from the beginning, which Thomas was not, and she had her mother's manner of looking at things still and precise, as though measuring. Harriet recognized this immediately, and it made her laugh, which Edgar thought was the best sound he had ever heard in the house. Thomas, who was 1 year and 4 months old and had been prepared for the arrival with as much explanation as was useful at that age, regarded his sister with the solemn interest of someone encountering something genuinely new and deciding how to classify it. He patted her head once, carefully, and then went back to the wooden survey pin he had been playing with, which was the survey equipment he had chosen as a personal possession from the earliest age he could choose such things, and which Harriet took as a sign. The years that followed were years of building in every sense that word has. The house grew, a room added when the children needed it, the kitchen extended when Harriet's survey practice generated the income that made it practical, a new stable built when the survey work required a second horse. The land grew, the garden Harriet had planned in those first weeks of planning was producing by the second year and flourishing by the fifth. The orchard trees planted in the spring of 1880 were bearing by 1885, and the small portion of grain she grew in the east field was less about profit than about the principle of the thing, the idea that the land was not just an address but a participation. The survey practice grew. By 1883, Harriet Keating, working under that professional name, honoring her father as she had promised herself she would, was one of the most respected land surveyors in the eastern part of Kansas Territory. She had trained 2 additional surveyors, both young men who had come to Caldwell for the cattle work, and discovered that survey work suited them better, and she ran her practice with the directness and precision that her father had brought to his, with an additional quality that she thought of as her own. She was meticulous about accuracy, not just for legal reasons, but because she believed that people making their lives on the land deserved to know exactly what they were building on. She surveyed claims for homesteaders of every description: German farmers, former soldiers, families from the eastern states, the occasional freedman who had come west in the years following the Civil War in search of the land and life that had been denied him in the South. These last cases she took with particular care, because the legal protections for black homesteaders were imperfect and the practical obstacles significant, and she understood that accuracy in the official record was sometimes the only protection that a marginalized person had against the particular dishonesty that power directed at the vulnerable. Edgar supported this work completely and entirely, and he used his position at the Federal Land Office to ensure that the registrations she submitted were processed with the same rigorous accuracy as every other submission, which should have been automatic and was not always without his specific oversight. He did not announce this. He simply did it because it was right, in the way he did all the things that were right. Thomas grew into a boy who was quieter than the Kansas wind and more persistent than the Kansas weather, and who had, by the age of 6, a fundamental understanding of how to read a compass that Harriet found both expected and moving. Clara was noisier and faster, and had a quality of absolute social ease that neither of her parents possessed to the same degree, and which Mrs. Fenn, who was their devoted and irregular grandmother in all but name, declared was a gift from the frontier itself. In the winter of 1885, when Thomas was 5 and Clara was 4, Harriet came in from a late survey job in the last of the November light, and found Edgar at the north desk with 2 letters in front of him, and an expression that she had learned to read as the expression of a man who has received good news and bad news in the same envelope, and is deciding how to hold both at once. "Tell me," she said, pulling off her gloves and sitting across from him. He told her. The first letter was from the Bureau of Land Management in Washington. There was a national initiative to standardize land survey methods across the Western territories, and Edgar had been nominated by Graves in Wichita and by the Kansas Territorial Surveyor General to serve on the advisory panel developing the new standards. It would involve 3 trips to Washington over the following 2 years, which was a considerable undertaking. The second letter was from Harriet's cousin in Pennsylvania, the only family she still had regular contact with in the East, informing her that the house in Glenford, which had been rented out after Thomas Slater's death, had finally been sold, and that there was a sum of money from the estate that had never been fully distributed at the time of settlement and which now legally belonged to Harriet. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Take the panel appointment. It is exactly the kind of national work your land registry system deserves to influence." "I thought you would say that," he said. "I wanted to discuss it properly rather than assume." "You knew what I would say," she said. "I appreciate that you asked." She paused. "The Glenford money. What do you want to do with it?" She thought about it. She looked at the compass on the desk. She thought about Thomas Slater and the Pennsylvania house and the deed that had crossed 4 states and 2 territories inside her boot. She thought about what he had wanted and what he had understood. "I want to use it to expand the orchard," she said. "And I want to put a proper brass survey plaque at the northwest corner of the 60 acres. With his name on it, Thomas Slater, surveyor, because it was his land to start with and it should say so." Edgar looked at her with the open face. "And I want," she said more quietly, "to write his full name in the deed record as original claimant. I know the legal record shows it was transferred through the fraudulent scheme, but the official Keating farm record, the one we keep in the house, should show him at the beginning, as the man who found this place first." "Yes," Edgar said, "it should." They had the plaque made in Wichita by a metalsmith who did precise work, and they set it at the northwest corner in the spring of 1886, in the spot where Edgar had first kissed Harriet on an October afternoon. Thomas, who was 6, drove the post with a hammer that was too large for him and managed it with a determination that the occasion seemed to demand. Clara provided enthusiastic commentary from the perimeter. Harriet knelt at the plaque for a moment, alone, and held the compass. The needle pointed north. The brass was new and bright in the spring sun. "I kept the promise," she said quietly, to the ground and the air and the man who was no longer there and the 60 acres that had always been there, waiting for someone to arrive and know them for what they were. "I came in the direction you pointed, and I found the right one." She stood up. Edgar was there, 3 steps away, waiting with the patience that was his nature and his gift, his shadow falling across the new grass of the Slater and Keating land. "Ready?" he said. She held the compass level. The needle was true. North was north. She had chosen this direction every day for 8 years, and she would choose it every day that followed, and every day it would be right, because she was her father's daughter, and her father had taught her that the only thing a compass could not do was choose for you. She closed her hand around it and looked at her husband and their children on their land under the Kansas sky in the spring of 1886, and felt the complete and unreserved fullness of a life that had been built in exactly the direction it was meant to go. "Ready," said Harriet Slater Keating, and she was.